We talked about some injuries in some previous podcasts, and we saw that in North America East. A couple guys withdrew. I don't know how many. I don't think it was that many in the West, which is awesome. I'm glad that not that many people got hurt. But it is something that we need to talk about, right? Like, what happens or how do you handle injuries in a competition? But then also, like, are there ways that we can prepare athletes better to avoid injury, and is there a better way to program to avoid injury, especially at the highest level?
Yeah, I think so. So first off, I know I didn't look at how many people withdrew from the West, so I only know that the semifinal East, North America East, and there were 6 athletes. Not all of them withdrew for a pec injury, just to be clear.
Right.
I think Griffin his was a knee or a calf, and I think that one of the Panchik brothers had an ankle or calf. I'm not entirely sure about that, but 6% of the field had to pull out because of injury, 10% of the field had to pull out because of injury. And I think that is it's a potential reflection on the programming. If it were 1 or 2 athletes, like it was, in the West semifinal,
I'm pulling it up right now to see.
Then I think it's less of a programming issue. It's more of a like, hey, this athlete maybe had something pre-existing coming in. Now, with that being said, I think I'm looking at the pec injuries and I'm looking at programming, and I think about it like this. We have weighted ring muscle ups Friday night. They were getting done around 7:30. Then they go directly into the athlete briefing. So they're not really having an opportunity to recover or take care of their bodies the way they need to until probably closer to like 8:30 or 9. And then they're back in the morning, 12 hours later, to do Linda with double dumbbell bench. And like, as someone who's programmed for this athletes in the sport of CrossFit for, 12 years now, or however long, 12 years now, one thing that I wouldn't typically do is do weighted muscle ups and the next day do dumbbell bench or bench press in general. Like, that's just something that you would tend to avoid, because that in weighted ring muscle ups, athletes are going to catch lower in the dip. And when they catch lower in the dip, different parts of the pec are going to be stressed than are typically stressed when you're just doing a regular muscle up. And that athletes haven't been doing a ton of weighted ring muscle ups, right? It's just not something that has shown up a lot. So it's not like something that they're doing a ton of. So they're not prepped and ready for that. And then you have the 90 and 60 pound dumbbells come out in Linda. Again, people may have been doing dumbbell bench, but they probably been using 70s and 50s, because that's what we've seen programmed in the past when, the dumbbells were released. And so it's just like our athletes are generally unprepared for this. And then you take 2 movements that you generally wouldn't program in back-to-back workouts and put them back-to-back, right? 2 very pec dominant workouts right in a row. And I think that is definitely putting the athletes at risk. And, I said this in one of our other podcasts, but I think prioritizing athlete safety should be the number one thing that you're thinking about when you're creating programming for a competition.
Right.
And I just look at that and I was like, well, that's undermining rule number 1. Rule number 1 is keep the athlete safe. And if that's rule number 1, then you don't do weighted ring muscle ups, and then in the next event do double dumbbell bench press. Maybe you spread those out throughout the weekend, or maybe you just choose different tests.
Yeah. Real quick, there were 4 males that withdrew. So, not 6, but still that's a big chunk of the competition. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I didn't look at the female side yet.
And one of those being our boy Connor Duddy.
Well, no, 6 at East and 4 in the West. So there were 10 total just on the male side of all those in North America, which again is still that's almost 10% of the competition.
Breaking
some of those
hard CrossFit.
And we don't know the injury. Some of those may just they decided to withdraw because they weren't doing well. Like we don't know that, but just, for what it's worth, we saw pec injuries at East, and we know that was an issue because they went from the PM workout on Friday to the Linda workout on
But the
Saturday.
bummer there is, did Adam said that he could look on paper well ahead of the event, and he saw that was going to be a problem.
Let me push back on this real quick. I'm gonna be in the CrossFit camp for just a few minutes because I think this is important. Castro said this after, I think it was 2018 or 19, whatever year
18.
was the dumbbell. Yeah. He said it's the athlete's job to prepare to recover quickly and to be able to handle that kind of volume. And he didn't do it in a harsh way, but that's basically was his answer to all of the injuries we had in 2018. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that is a valid argument in that athletes should be prepared for, high volumes of horizontal pressing, ring dips and bench press and things like that. But I think the way that you program it, the order of programming matters. And I know that because I do programming for a living. You know what I mean? Like that's something that I know that if I were to put weighted ring dips and then bench press and back-to-back workouts, that I'm opening my athletes up to a much greater risk of injury than if I space those out.
And you're mostly looking at training days.
Training days.
This is like a racing to fucking go day.
Yes. And I think the other racing to fucking go day, the other counter argument to that
different.
Is if HQ would say simply, here are some of the movements that you need to make sure that you're prepared for.
Right.
We're going to do weighted dips or weighted muscle ups, and we're going to do double dumbbell bench at these loads. And you let the athletes know right after quarterfinals, then that becomes a very valid argument. Yes, they should have been prepared for those movements because they knew that they were coming, but there's no way to know what's coming because of the unknown and unknowable aspect of the sport. Now, they can say, well, that's what you should be training for, but 55 dumbbell bench at 90 and 60 pounds and what is essentially, it's 10 ring muscle ups and 10, how many total was it?
15 ring muscle ups, 15 ring dips.
15 and 15. So
plus the total ring is still opening and closing the shoulder girdle.
Not only that, but it's stressing the pec minor,
Correct.
Which is also, I don't want to get into the physiology of it, but it's all
all
there's
pec. A stressor there.
Right. It's all pec. Like they could have just simply come out and given a hint, right? Double dumbbell, like shown someone doing double dumbbell bench in the way that Castro used to do. He used to drop those kind of hints. I think that would have been a very simple way to make sure that athletes were more prepared for it.
Now, here was the, I don't know if it was a complaint. Maybe an announcer said this, but they said the issue was people trained it too much before the competition. Who was it? An announcer that said that?
No. I spoke to someone at the airport that's with HQ.
Okay.
And
so
we talked about this exactly, and that was their argument.
Okay.
Was that
what do you say about that?
I would have agreed with it if it were one or two people, but the fact that it was 10% of the field that got injured, and granted, not all of them were pec injuries, but the fact that it was 10% of the field immediately tells you that it's not an over or under preparation issue. It's potentially an issue with the programming.
Yeah.
Like at least that's my perspective.
Right.
And I looked at it like this. If I were designing a training program for someone, I wouldn't put those two things back to back because there's a risk of injury. So if you're designing a testing weekend, right, which is what this is, like a competition weekend, you wouldn't put those two things back to back because there's a risk of injury.
Right.
Because the risk of injury is too high. It would be no different than like the touch and go power snatch event, right? Imagine taking out the 8 touch and go power snatch at 185 into the sprint on the assault runner, the 800 meter sprint, and you replace those 8 touch and go power snatch with 8 touch and go deadlift at 405, 255, or whatever the appropriate women's weight would be for that into the 800 meter sprint on the assault runner. Would you program that?
No, I wouldn't want anybody to have hamstring issues.
Hamstring tears, right. This is what I'm getting at.
Right, but they have programmed that in the past. They did heavy deadlifts with
running, but not sprinting.
Not a sprint. Okay.
Right? And so I'm looking at it from that perspective. You're asking people with Linda with double dumbbell to go unbroken. Like you're begging them to go unbroken there.
Well, to do well, you have to.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, here's another one though. All right, I'm going to just keep pushing on this.
I'm going to take a drink.
Yes, please do. So the other argument I've heard, not from anyone at HQ, this is just people in the comments from previous videos that we've done, is, well, if you look at a sport like football, there are injuries every single week. So there are 45 guys on a team. There are 53 on the roster, 45 that actually can play for those that know how it works in the NFL, but 45 active players. And on average, there's anywhere from 2 to 4 that get hurt every single week. So that's close to 10% every single week in the NFL that are getting hurt. Now, they'll play the next week often because it's not like a catastrophic injury. Maybe there is a tear or ACL injury, whatever. But if that's at 10% and CrossFit's at 10%, there's no different.
I agree. But there's a difference in the source of the injury or the type of injury. So in football, you have what I would call like impact injury, right? So most of the injuries occur from someone running into something.
Yes.
Right? Like there is a high risk of injury when someone runs into someone else and they're both big and they're both moving really fast.
So it's just inherently more dangerous.
Yes. In fact, if you look at the statistics on weightlifting or CrossFit training, the injury risk is extremely low, like extremely low.
And by the way, CrossFit prides itself on that. They've posted often on that.
It's extremely low. It's not 10% of people that go to a CrossFit gym get injured. It's way lower than that. And that's why I'm saying that if you look at participation in CrossFit, the injury rate is very low. But if you look at competition in this semifinal, not all semifinals, there's not normally this percent of people pulling out for a similar injury, except when they throw ring dips or
Right.
things like that.
2018.
Yes. That tells us that it's potentially a problem with the program. You can use, there are people that are way better at stats than I am, and they can use the stats to tell this story in a much more convincing way. But I'm just looking at it like we're talking about a sport that has one of the lowest injury rates of any sport, way lower than gymnastics. CrossFit's injury rate's way lower. If you look at competitive, it's lower than competitive swimming. I was a competitive swimmer. There was like one person on my team that was ever injured, right? They'd have like a shoulder.
I mean, that makes sense though.
Right? It's just super low, but CrossFit statistically is lower than that, right? Participate. And then we have 10%.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that tells me it's probably a programming problem.
Yeah.
And I know that there are people at HQ that would argue with me on this all day long, but I'm certainly not going to change my mind here.
Yeah.
Like I'm a pretty open-minded person, but I also have been doing this for a really long time, and I know what creates the risk for injury. And like I said, weighted ring dip into bench press, that's pretty good risk for injury. Heavy deadlift into sprinting on an assault runner, that's pretty good risk for injury, right? So if you know that those combinations are dangerous, don't program it.
All right, so I'm going to just give you kind of two scenarios to wrap this one up,
Go.
okay? The first one is, let's just assume that CrossFit stays the same. It always has. We've had this complaint that they don't really listen to the feedback and they just keep doing the same thing over and over again. If that's the case, and we know that programming will be, a ring complex with a weight vest into double dumbbell bench or regular barbell bench or, a bunch of burpees into dumbbell bench, whatever it may be, because they like to tax like a certain system. How will you program moving forward, or what would you suggest athletes do to at least prepare themselves for that onslaught of like a specific movement pattern?
Yeah, I think that is a really challenging question from a programming perspective because that combination is inherently more dangerous than clean and jerk and bench press,
right?
Just as an example. So I think one of the things that you're going to really look at is stability. So as soon as you get on the rings and you're locking out those dips, you're locking out those muscle ups, and you've added the weight vest, you're challenging smaller muscle groups in a way that wouldn't normally get challenged, right? I mean, if you're not wearing a 20-pound ruck and you're on the rings, it's just less of a stability challenge than wearing the ruck. And so I think making sure that you're addressing some of the smaller stabilizer muscles, whether that's through, doing things like ring supports with weight or, even doing ring complexes where there's pauses in the bottom, pauses at the top, adding longer eccentric tempos to some of your gymnastic strength. We talked in an earlier podcast about in the off season, spending time doing gymnastic strength work, using eccentric tempos, pauses in the bottom, pauses at the top, isometric work. All of those things are going to strengthen the connective tissues that are going to help to prevent some injury. And then on the bench press side, doing things like chaos band bench press, right? Where you loop bands through kettlebells and perform them that way. Because one of the challenges, I think one of the places where the injuries occurred is if the dumbbells just get a little bit too wide because the pec is fatigued.
And it's easy to do that for those that haven't done a workout with dumbbell bench.
Yeah, it's if you're fatigued, and especially if your triceps are fatigued
so hard to stabilize
from the lockout, then it becomes, exponentially harder to stabilize the dumbbells, especially when they're that heavy. So just spending time doing things that allow you to really focus on building stabilizers. And then same thing, starting with eccentric tempos, isometrics in the bottom and the top, spending time with that stuff in your off season and slowly, gradually building volume. I mean, if you want to make someone resilient to anything, you use progressive overload, right? And then it's not unknown and unknowable and constantly varied. Then it's constantly consistent. Right. You need to be doing the same movements
you're building them into that overload
over time. Right. And it has to be done. It doesn't have to be done linearly. It can be done with like an undulating periodization, using buckets. You've talked about buckets, right? Horizontal pressing buckets, barbell bench, dumbbell bench, ring dips,
right?
Various, ring push-ups on the floor.
Yeah,
all those
bars,
things can all be trained, but they're going to have to be done consistently and in this progressive overloaded manner. And you're going to have to spend time taking care of the little tiny muscles that create stability, because when the big muscles get fatigued from weighted ring dip complexes or weighted complexes, and then doing 90-pound dumbbell bench, that's when everything opens up for injury. And that's when the little stabilizers matter. They don't matter when you're just trying to get, trying to put up a good 225 bench for 5.
Yeah.
I think matter.
All those tips are ones that I would recommend our listeners do. When we talk about, or when I talk about like structural strength, that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's like the stability side of the joint first, so that is strong enough, tolerant enough to do the CrossFit movements, because at some point you do have to test it, and you're doing 30 muscle ups and burpees and dumbbell bench, and there is a lot of chaos. So you need to build that strength in the joint first and all the systems that go around the joint so that you can do those things well.
Yeah, I would completely.
All right, so
agree with
here's
that.
the other scenario. Let's say CrossFit listens to you and decides to program in a different way. How would you, let's just say those 2 events will be in the competition. How are you ordering them? Do you just separate them by a day? Do you do them on the same day? Like, how are you doing this?
Definitely not on the same day. So
Giving you all the scenarios.
That's your AM and your PM. Oh, man. So the injury rate goes from 6 to 10. No, I think separating them by a full day would probably be wise. I think even separating them potentially, so you have your ring dip complex event 2 as the PM event on day 1 on Friday, and then you do Linda as the PM event, but make sure that whatever you program, since I'm locked into these 2 events, whatever you program in the morning is not going to necessarily fatigue the upper body in a way to allow them to recover. Those athletes are going to recover in 24 hours. So give them 24 hours of recovery time and then run that same test. And I think you have a lower injury rate. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
So essentially you just want to space them out more.
Yeah. Or have Linda be event 1 on day 3 and make sure that day 2, maybe the endurance test goes on day 2, right? Because it's not going to be fatiguing to the pecs in the same way. And then trying to think through the other events to what you could have put there. I would not have put the handstand push-up rope climb there. Maybe the sprint, the toes to bar sprint. Oh, that would have been an awful day 2, actually.
That would have been brutal.
That would have been nasty.
Yeah. But it's funny. I from the feedback that I got, most athletes said it was actually the easiest testing that they've had, just because they had to slow it. Like, they naturally had to pace most of those workouts. And even with the endurance test, it just came down to how fast you can move the sled. So they weren't necessarily as tired as they would have been if the sled was just a little easier to pull. So, all right.
Back to your NFL thing, NFL injury and CrossFit injury. I think if I was to have a choice, I would rather be the injured NFL guy who has a big salary and the team team paid for me to fly out to my game.
Here's the question for you. What's the better position?
And I have access to the best physicians in the world and stuff to heal me.
Would you rather be the backup quarterback, like second in line, that has a pretty big salary, but you may have to go in? Like, if this guy gets hurt, you're in the spotlight in the playoffs, and you better not screw up. Everyone hates you. But, let's say you're making $8 million a year. Or the backup punter, you'll never go in, but your salary's $500K a year. Which one are you taking?
Challenge. I'd be the backup quarterback.
You want the challenge?
I like the challenge. I'd be so bored.
That is true. There would be a lot of boredom.
I don't think I could be the backup water boy.
Yeah. We wouldn't be any of those things. All right, let's go into the last topic. I wanted to...
last topic.
Yeah.
What is it?
We're going to talk about the differences between the top 10 and the 10 to 20. Do you need to go?
We have 20 minutes.
All right.
Hope you enjoyed this clip from episode 134 of the Corpus Animus podcast. To hear the other clips, you can click here on the screen or listen to the audio version in full on all major podcast providers.